For the rim. Got it! Oh, the slam. Oh, using Curry. Way downtown. Oh, what a shot from Curry.
Back when I was a wee lad, many eons ago, you could not escape Detroit Pistons' success. I'm speaking of that time in the early to mid 2000s when they were quite literally always one of the league's top teams. This is only on my mind recently because after their latest dreadful start, I sat back and thought, this feels like an everlasting script at this point. Then you see their franchise information on Basketball Reference where their players with top win shares over the relatively recent years are Andre Drummond, Greg Monroe, and you're like, right, this tracks. What's truly happened here though? In this video, I'm going to be as detailed as possible in showing you how we got from this ultra competitive championship team to what's now quickly approaching 15 to 20 years of, well, failure. Back to the part where I was a wee little lad. The Pistons owned a majority of that sliver of time in the Eastern Conference after Michael Jordan, but before LeBron James completely took over. Between 2003 and 2008, the franchise would see either an Eastern Conference Finals or the NBA Finals every single year, famously taking home the trophy in 04 when they were thought to be outmatched. From 05 to 08, 3 of the 4 teams to eliminate them would go on to win the title, meaning they were just ever so close to a second ring, which of course was made painful by the fact they could have drafted Melo, Wade, or Bosh with the second overall pick in 2003. Despite still winning the championship that season, the pick could have been of extreme importance as you're about to see. They sorely needed a torchbearer as the core began to age, causing this to go deeper than just, oh hey, they lost out on a few more titles. In 07 and 08, it's also important to note they were still in the conference finals despite the absence of Ben Wallace, who'd spurned them in 2006 free agency for the Chicago Bulls. Not only had he felt undervalued for some time now, there'd been tension between him and coach Flip Saunders, who Wallace felt did not focus enough on defense. With Detroit proceeding to offer him $49 million to Chicago's $60 in free agency, he moved on at a time where he was the reigning repeat Defensive Player of the Year, also having won 4 total since 2002. This was the official start to the free fall of the Pistons that continues today, all the way back in the summer of 06. After those next unsuccessful title runs, Joe Dumars rightfully pressed reset at the beginning of the 2009 campaign, as a deal became available to swap Chauncey Billups with Allen Iverson. Not only had the core clearly run its course, AI's contract was expiring, along with Rasheed Wallace's, granting them cap space as soon as the upcoming summer. After a predictable first-round exit to the Cavaliers, this cap space would be allocated between Ben Gordon and Charlie Villanueva. I promise this looked like an amazing idea in the summer of 09. I was even intrigued enough by it to put the roster together in NBA 2K9 and run it myself. Instead of the projected success, however, coming off of promising seasons, the duo would regress and disappoint while Detroit floundered to a 27-win record. Gordon would proceed to have ankle surgery, as we never got another glimpse of the player who appeared in the 7-game thriller against Boston just 1 season prior. Mind you, this duo was in their mid to late 20s at the time of signing. Had they panned out as intended, Detroit was headed back towards competitive basketball after not even a full season of rebuilding. Alas, we've approached the segment where it gets real depressing real fast, as it god honestly just did not go anywhere for the next 5 seasons. Truth be told, it never even trended toward looking promising. In 2011, they'd signed T-Mac's leftovers, who somewhere in a press conference said he'd do everything in his power to bring Detroit a title, which was just the same level of delusion that spurred a commentator around this time to blurt out that Rodney Stuckey was the next Dwayne Wade. To this day, I cannot prove that broadcast exists, but I know what I heard. And yes, just as an aside, with Gordon and Charlie having robbed the city, Stuckey was the next glimmer of hope who'd actually been developing for them since being drafted in 2007. Really like a last-ditch hope at that point. It was also lottery pick Greg Monroe's first season in the league. Take note of that, it'll be hilarious in a sec. For the 2012 season, the big move was drafting guard Brandon Knight, which also will be hilarious. They were now down to 25 wins, however, I guess it counts as an improvement seeing how they played 16 less games for the lockout season. 2013 hits, and welcome Andre Drummond to the cast, who, as mentioned earlier, will go on to lead the unit in win shares for 5 of the next 7 years. That could have been promising if you knew absolutely nothing of what was to come. It probably hurts even more when you realize with the 39th pick in the second round, they'd select the relatively unknown Chris Middleton. Any of you happen to have his card or jersey from his 27 games in Motor City? Cause, you know, he was traded in a deal along with Knight for Brandon Jennings, and yeah, you know the rest. It's just very cruel. We're at the point where I've covered 3 straight years of lotto picks for this organization, and the most impactful and successful player came in the second round. Just also have to slip in here, Brandon Knight being shipped off came on the heels of some extremely embarrassing moments that still ring throughout NBA history to this very day. In any case, Chris is just one name in a long line of players the Pistons would give up on or lose to early who maybe, emphasis on maybe, could have helped steer the ship in the correct direction. No matter though, for their next big splash, and biggest splash since the 2009 signings, the Detroit Pistons would send $54 million to Josh Smith for 4 years of his service. If you've been keeping track at home, yes, you're not missing anything, you didn't write it down incorrectly. It does in fact mean they were donning a starting lineup of Greg Monroe, Andre Drummond, and their newly minted, lightly used Josh Smith. I promise you that in the year 2014, basketball was not different enough for this lineup to have made sense. It was different, it was not that different. And just in case you were wondering, Smith shot the highest 3-point percentage of the trio at 26%. He was an exciting player, he was really good when he was young. He did not fit with this roster whatsoever. Cool though. With yet another top 10 pick, they'd also nabbed Kentavious Caldwell-Pope, who would maybe alleviate the shooting issues in the future, and there was still the slightest bit of hope Brandon Jennings could tap into whatever that was in his 50-point rookie game. Hey look, he even threw a sick lob off the glass to Andre Drummond at the start of the season. Alright, so all the nonsense results in a 29-win outing, marking their 3rd straight year of sub-30 victories, which would have been 4 except, well, they won exactly 30 in 2011. That brings us to 2015, where there was at least a semblance of an idea coming together. Andre Drummond was a solid center, if not a future all-star. Greg Monroe wasn't technically bad either, while KCP was improving. At ages 21 and 24 respectively, Stan Van Gundy made the call signaling it was time to focus solely on developing young assets. Breaking the news to Josh Smith himself, he was waived, still with 2 years remaining on his deal. It was December, by the way. He got sent packing near the beginning of an ongoing campaign. Speaking of younger assets, they had also lucked into Spencer Dinwiddie through the draft, once again in the second round. He could have found a role there once Brandon Jennings went down with a torn Achilles, with Stan instead opting to trade for electric sixth-man Reggie Jackson to pick up the mantle. The move prompted tweets from Jackson, which may be the happiest you ever see any player ever to join the Detroit Pistons. They would go one more season without the playoffs, meaning they hadn't achieved defeat since the turn of the decade. Landing us in 2016, they would trade what was left of Brandon Jennings and Ersan Ilyasova for Tobias Harris, whose play had been on a downturn throughout the season for the Orlando Magic. Combined with drafting Stanley Johnson 8th overall and losing Greg Monroe to the Bucks via a max contract, their first playoff roster in 7 seasons was complete. Presumably their core for the future as well. Young wings, a now all-star big in Drummond, shedding excess players, they only needed time and to keep scrounging fitting pieces over the years. This sentiment was backed by their impressive playoff performance against the eventual champion Cleveland Cavaliers. While it was a sweep, I'd call it one of the closest sweeps in recent memory, as 3 of the 4 matches ended conceivably close, which was far more than anyone expected coming into it. Hell, I'd argue just competing in 1 game would have shocked us. Unfortunately, there would be zero building upon this successful 44-win season as the roster essentially stagnated. Andre Drummond did not improve after signing a $127 million contract. Stanley Johnson reached into exactly 0 of his top 10 potential, which would become a theme. Reggie Jackson was hampered by a knee injury, and Spencer Dinwiddie wasn't there to develop and step into the role, as Detroit had quietly traded him away in the offseason for absolutely nothing. With no movement in the direction laid for the previous year, it was back to no playoffs, yet at least they'd nearly won 40 games, I guess. Desperate to capitalize on the momentum found in 2017, they would spend no more time in hoping and praying on development and breakthroughs. A deal would be struck for Blake Griffin, who'd literally just signed a 5-year extension that summer with the Clippers. The swap required Tobias Harris, Avery Bradley, Boban Marjanovic with a first and second round draft pick. By trading for an established star in his prime, the idea was likely that they'd sped up the timeline and hopefully inch toward building a respected and competitive core without having to put in the organic work. Clearly, the youth movement had grown tired, as in the 2017 offseason, Detroit refused to meet Kentavious Caldwell-Pope's asking price, opting to instead acquire Avery Bradley, who was, as mentioned, dealt to Los Angeles. In hindsight, the transaction can be described as rushed incompetence. The deal for Blake cost the Pistons much of their depth, looking very much like the kind of move a team makes when they're considered close or in position to go for it. This team, qualifying as neither, had now committed $73 million for the upcoming season in just Blake, Drummond, and Reggie Jackson, who was fresh off of his second straight injury-riddled campaign, which no doubt contributed to them once again missing the playoffs. Thus, the 2019 season would hinge almost totally on health, alongside how good Blake could be and how well he'd fit with Drummond. It's also likely worth noting in the second round, they'd find a future gem in Bruce Brown at the 42nd pick, making it their third second round hit throughout this whole process. How consistently these second round guys wound up better than a lot of their top 10 picks is just wow. Anyways, health did permit. Drummond improved slightly coming off of his second All-Star appearance, and Blake Griffin posted one of the best years of his career, whilst donning the best three-point shooting campaign he'd ever see with 36% on 7 attempts. A hot-button issue if he were to coexist with Drummond. This granted him what was sadly his final All-Star berth, as Detroit finished 500 to eke back into the postseason. While of course it was just a quick sweep against Milwaukee, there's still no doubt that the front office was pleased with their first full year of Blake. Here's the thing about Blake. As we reviewed, trading for him in this stage was a huge risk, not only because they didn't necessarily need him, he'd also spent much of the decade being heavily injury prone. So although he was magically successful in 2019, one likely ailment could easily set the franchise back to the Stone Ages, as he could lose his trade value and on-court productivity all at once while being owed so much money. In 2020, Griffin would lose his trade value and on-court productivity all at once while being owed so much money. After missing the first 10 games recovering from knee surgery, he would require a second operation with just 18 games played, shutting him down for the remainder of the campaign. Honestly, this failed venture just about kicked off the rebuild saga they're currently in. There would be no long drawn-out Blake era where they brought in another star, nor would he and Drummond build something sustainable as they grew into a fringe playoff team or contender. As a matter of fact, knowing this, the Pistons hit the official reset, trading Drummond to the Cavs after around 8 seasons of very random rosters around him. He had essentially been their true cornerstone after the original core from the 2000s, which sounds crazy looking back. To be fair, with averages of 14 points, 14 rebounds, and 2 blocks a game throughout the time, he'd garnered attention as a player that could make that difference for some team, which the next year of league-wide interest would go on to show. He, on the other hand, was not happy about the trade, marking the second tweet I've ever seen implying a guy truly wanted to be in Detroit. In any case, it was a wrap on that era, with the team now employing an incredibly random cast of characters via an overhaul completed by new general manager Troy Weaver. This included a sign-in trade to land Jeremy Grant on a 3-year $60 million deal, another trade granting them the draft rights to Isaiah Stewart, using the 7th overall pick to select Killian Hayes, and sending Luke Kennard away to the Clippers for 19th overall pick Sadiq Bey. Long story short, a rebuild, which was not aided by their ailing star Blake Griffin. Once again, the risk in the first place. They couldn't even find a trade partner to move the former household name, forcing the front office to buy him out in March of 2021. The end. Oh, and if you're wondering where Bruce Brown wound up in all of this, in November of 2020, he was traded to the Nets for a guy you've never heard of and a 2021 second rounder. So throw him on top of the pile of players they hit gold with in the second round, only to lose far before he could prove himself useful to the unit. Needless to say, no playoffs, and that more or less moves you to where the Pistons are today. They drafted Cade Cunningham to their rebuild project for the 2022 season and are still to this day attempting to figure out the dynamic between him and Killian Hayes, which quite obviously makes little sense. Acquiring Marvin Bagley late that same season, a similar dynamic is taking place as Monty Williams currently mulls over how to manage his minutes with Jalen Duren and James Wiseman. Their deal to acquire Duren being one of the more positive things they've done in over a decade. Obviously, Jeremy Grant's time with the team ran out as he made little sense to their direction. Then they drafted Jaden Ivey, yet another guard tossed into the mix as they figure out where this roster is going. Finally, yet another new lottery pick, granting them uber athletic and versatile forward Azor Thompson, who looks very promising. As a matter of fact, many names on this roster look promising. It's really just currently a matter of selecting which young guys are there to stay, adding pieces that fit, and hopefully one day actually being able to break through. However, today is clearly not that day. They're currently on a 9-win pace for the entire season, donning a record of 2-16 at the time of this recording, with very few wins appearing to be in sight on the near schedule. As you now see, if it feels like the Pistons have been bad all your life, it's because they truly have been, most likely. 2 playoff appearances total since they completely blew up the core in 2009, both resulting in sweeps. Nearly 8 years of an Andre Drummond-led cast that never consistently built towards anything. Multiple useful young players falling off the roster before they could truly contribute. Lottery pick after lottery pick just not helping to take the franchise in any discernible direction. Topped off with questionable trade/free agent signings that never made total sense to the state of their roster in the first place. In a nutshell, this is how you've went from the most consecutive conference finals appearances for a team in 2 decades to an organization that is now quickly approaching 2 decades of stagnation and failure.